Welcome to the Latin American Iberian Institute for today's installment of the SOLAS Presents Lecture Series, hosted by the Student Organization for Latin American Studies, or SOLAS. Today our presenter is Daniel Cozart. He's a graduate student studying Latin American history here at UNM. His research focuses on the social and political history of Afro-descendants in northern Peru and Lima from the abolition of slavery in 1854 through the mid-20th century. In the summer of 2013, Dan traveled to Peru after receiving funding through the Latin American Iberian Institute and Tinker Foundation, who provides the field research grants here at UNM. Today he will present some of the insights gained from this research trip. Join me in welcoming Dan Cozart.
Thanks so much, Sam. Thank you all for coming out to hear me talk about some research I did last summer. I'd like to begin by also thanking SOLAS and thanking the Latin American Iberian Institute and the Tinker Foundation for affording me this really great opportunity to do some pre-dissertation research in Lima, Trujillo, and Piura, Peru over the month of June this past summer. So this is a work in progress. I appreciate any kind of feedback you all might be able to give me. And I'll be presenting this also at a couple other conferences later this semester, so really be critical. I appreciate it. So this is a working title, Abolition and Its Malcontents, the Sale of a Freed Slave in Piura, Peru in 1855. On October 10th, 1855, a woman in the northern city of Piura, Peru, was charged with knowingly selling a former slave, then her servant, under the pretext that she was the legal owner. Doña Adela Seminario had sold the former slave, Mariana Regada y Seminario, to Don Ramón Diaz on April 13th of that year, for 150 pesos. Realizing that the woman he had purchased as a slave was in fact free, Diaz brought civil and later criminal charges against the seller, Doña Adela Seminario. The former owner denied any knowledge of her slave's freedom and was pressed for documentation of ownership. I'm just going to show some pictures as I go through this intro. Interestingly, neither the prosecuting attorney nor the defense mentioned the national decree made by President Ramón Castilla 5 months prior to this transaction, which effectively abolished the institution of slavery in Peru. Indeed, the absences as well as the content of the legal battle between Seminario and Diaz reveal a great deal about a local reality in contrast to national legal and economic authority. So going from Lima, this is kind of the path I took on my research trip, to Trujillo, and eventually to Piura. How could a former slave not be aware of her freed status? The court case that ensued between October 1855 and February 1856 in Piura offers a window to understand the social conditions in Peru's transition from slavery to a wage labor economy. The legend of El Gran Libertador, Ramón Castilla, presents a rather convenient narrative of the end of slavery in Peru. In something of an ideological transformation for the Caudillo president and the nation, as the narrative goes, Castilla declared on December 3, 1854, quote, "Men and women until now held in Peru as slaves and libertos, whose condition arises from having been transported as such or from having been born of a slave womb, who by whatever means are subject to perpetual or temporary servitude, are all without distinction of age from today and always free." However, this case suggests that the social attitudes toward Afro-descendant Peruvians and even the status of slave itself did not quickly change with this decree. When the civil case against Doña Adela began in October of 1855, the Piuran Justice of the Peace mandated that she present the document of ownership, which should have been given to Diaz at the time of purchase. Having admitted to the sale, Doña Adela was confessing to, quote, "the fraud of supposing a free person was a slave," end quote. Realizing she did not have the document, however, Doña Adela requested it from the previous owner, further complicating her defense. The attorney for Doña Mercedes Colonna, one of at least two prior owners, presented the document to the Justice of the Peace on October 18th. Rather than a document of ownership, Doña Mercedes' attorney presented a document confirming the freed status of Doña Adela's, quote, servant. Doña Mercedes proved that she had lent Mariana Regada 200 pesos for her manumission, who signed the document confirming her freedom apparently without knowing its contents. So I'll get to that in a second. Doña Mercedes, Mariana Regada's lack of knowledge of her own freedom only begins to explain her continued status as a slave, as this presentation will hopefully show. What other factors allowed slavery to continue after its abolition? How representative of Afro-Peruvian post-abolition social realities is this case? This paper aims to answer these questions by examining a local practice in contrast to national policy, analyzing the language of the case, and engaging the theoretical challenges of historical silence. Beyond her likely upper-class position as a Piuran slave owner accorded the honorific title Doña, archival census data provides clues regarding the social status of the defendant. In fact, even the limited census data from the mid-19th century Piura reveals that the Seminario family was among the upper echelons of the landholding and slaveholding elite within Piuran society. An 1840 census of the city, currently housed in the home museum Casa Museo of General Miguel Grau, lists Doña Adela Castañeda Seminario as the daughter of an hacendado. Doña Adela was 4 years old in 1840 and raised in a home which also, quote, attended to 4 slaves, Jose, Baltasar, Baltasara, and Simona, end quote. Doña Adela was therefore accustomed to living in a home that used slave labor. Moreover, she was also likely a direct relative of perhaps the most prestigious naval commander of Peru. The family unit that follows hers includes Don Miguel Grau y Seminario, 6 years of age at that time, whose family included 3 servants, as they're called. Miguel Grau later became an admiral of the Peruvian Navy and is still remembered as a national hero for his military exploits in the otherwise disastrous War of the Pacific. We can talk about the present repercussions of this towards the end of the talk, too, because this is ongoing today in Peru, between Peru and Chile. Doña Adela was roughly 19 years old when charged with fraud. She was single, but came from a family of privileged hacendados for whom ownership of African-descended slaves and servants was standard. Her actions and her legal defense, moreover, lend credence to assertions that possession of slaves remained an indicator of social status. In short, Doña Adela is representative of a powerful sector of society that benefited from the institution of slavery in northern Peru. As an educated elite of Piura, Doña Adela may have hurriedly sold her presumed slave while there was still a willing purchaser in this time during abolition. When compared with other civil or criminal cases in Piura in the years immediately preceding and following abolition, Doña Adela's decision to sell Mariana Dragada was not atypical. At the same time, however, neither was the decision to grant manumission to one slave, as Dragada's previous owner had done. Furthermore, civil records at the time of abolition reveal little differentiation between the status of slave and liberto, which literally translates to free. These terms were also frequently accentuated and substituted with terms denoting African racial identity, such as samba or sambo and mulata or mulatto, all understood and treated as merchandise. Piuran notarial records from 1854 reveal an interesting mixture of sales and manumissions of both slaves and libertos, without any apparent distinction between the categories. One such record recounts a remunerative donation from a 60-year-old mother to her daughter and son-in-law in March of 1854. The donation included a house valued at 450 pesos and thus resembles a will and testament. However, the donor, Doña María de las Nieves Armestar, specified that it was in payment for, quote, the services they offered during her emergencies, end quote. Doña María included a 10-year-old liberto, Jose María, whom she valued at 100 pesos in her donation, or will. In the same year, 5 libertos were exchanged as property, and 7 slaves were legally bought and sold. The status of the individual as slave or freed appears to have not influenced his or her prescribed monetary value. Of these cases, only one slave, Juana, purchased her freedom for 150 pesos. Another slave, a 43-year-old samba named Dominga, was granted manumission in her owner's will in October. A 38-year-old liberto, Don Jose Maria Machuca, was sold for 300 pesos in March. A 35-year-old Sambo slave named Torcibio de Valle was sold for 225 pesos the same month. A 29-year-old liberto, Eusebio Seminario, was sold for 150 pesos in June, and a 12-year-old liberto, Gabriel, was sold for 250 pesos in July. Finally, an outlying record documents Doña Manuela Garcia de Frias' sale of a 22-year-old slave named Maria Giraldo to a resident of Lima for the sum of 400 pesos. Although these records do not permit a correlation between age, gender, and occupation or skill level and the relative or prescribed value, they do show a disregard for freed or slave status. Piuran aristocrats purchased and sold both libertos and slaves at comparable prices, and as the sales of José María Machuca and Torcibo de Valle show, a liberto could be valued even more highly than a slave. Furthermore, notarial records from 1800 through 1854 show that the buying and selling of human beings was generally carried out between families and close relatives, likely to maintain social domination. In fact, just 5 families constituted the core of Piuran socio-economic slaveholding elite in this era, under their surnames Seminario, Del Castillo, Farfán, Adriansen, and Carrasco. The benefits of maintaining family networks at the local level may explain the higher price expected from a buyer in Lima, as demonstrated in the sale of Maria Giraldo. Nearly every record of these transactions notes the racial category of the person bought and sold, demonstrating an assumed association between phenotype and slave status. In short, Peruvians involved in the slave trade in 1854 placed racial identity above legal status. Economic factors were certainly a primary motivation for selling or purchasing a person of color at this time as well. While Peruvian officials hoped for an increase in immigrants from Europe, especially as thousands of migrants fled due to the revolutions of 1848, Piuran hacendados were concerned over the loss of free labor and the higher expectations of this immigrant labor. The economic concerns of these hacendados were also surely exacerbated by the agricultural losses due to a long drought in the region from 1838 to 1845. The social and economic motivations of Doña Adela Seminario are thus fairly accessible. Unfortunately, much less can be known of the background and motivations of the person at the center of the case, Mariana Dragada. Analyzing the civil case brought against Doña Adela through the lens of this sole written record risks conveying her as a passive actor, thereby limiting her agency. However, when placed in the context of 19th century slave resistance, Mariana Dragada's likely motivations can be better understood. Because the court records reveal more about the perspective of Piuran aristocrats at the time of slavery's abolition, a contextualization of slave resistance preceding this period is essential to understanding the social, economic, and personal motivations of Dragada. The slave population in Peru was concentrated along the northern coast, particularly in the valleys and cities between Piura and Ica. Slaves held a variety of occupations in urban centers such as Lima, but hacendados and the agriculture-based economy of Piura exploited their labor mainly as field hands and domestic servants. In Lima, slaves were domestic servants, artisans, and manual laborers. If a particular job lacked workers, slaves were found to learn the skill, thereby filling the gap and simultaneously increasing the slave's value. Slaves were simply expected to learn and carry out the task assigned to them by their owner, but there is evidence of resistance to these limitations. In spite of the direct orders to perform agricultural or domestic tasks, many slaves found employment beyond that mandated by their owner. Motivated by resistance, the possibility of purchasing manumission, or both, these slaves performed delinquent acts, also known as truancy, in the eyes of their owners by earning pay working for other haciendas. Nonetheless, there is not archival evidence of slave education and writing as a practical skill for such employment. In Dragada's case, literacy proved to be crucial to her knowledge of her own freed status. Doña Seminario had sold her servant to Don Diaz without giving him the official title of ownership, as I mentioned. A crucial witness and actor in the case, Doña Mercedes Colonna, had moved to Lima, apparently granting Doña Seminario a 7-month delay in the civil case. And there's a big gap in this document I'm looking at in that period, which leads me to believe that. Nonetheless, on April 12th of 1855, Piuran Justice of the Peace Francisco Meneses verbally demanded that Doña Seminario return the 150 pesos to Don Diaz. Diaz had received news of his slaves, quote, being free from the beginning, end quote, and Doña Seminario's inability to present documentation to prove otherwise was sufficient for the civil ruling. Still, the evidence was insufficient to charge Seminario with fraud, as she claimed to be unaware of Dragada's freedom. More pictures of Piura before we get to the case. Don Diaz was not satisfied with the ruling and declared his intentions to, quote, interpose against Adela and subsequently against the other sellers until establishing the truth, and upon seeing the document of ownership, hear a definitive sentence, end quote. Adela Seminario appealed the civil ruling on the following day, stating, quote, I do not know what I have to do with the enslavement or freedom of the aforementioned slave, end quote. In her defense, Doña Seminario claimed to have purchased the slave from Don Fernando Navarrete for 200 pesos and appealed to the Justice of the Peace to demand that this sum be returned to her or directly to Don Diaz. As both parties deemed the civil ruling insufficient, the case moved to criminal court on October 26, 1855. Don Diaz presented the civil ruling and certified copies of its documents to Provincial Justice Manuel Urbina to demand its execution, fearing that the civil case would otherwise remain, quote, illusory. Now on paper and printed with the official seal of the Peruvian Republic, as you can see up here, which is different from the previous slide where it was just the Piuran stamp at the bottom. Diaz's lawyer claimed that Doña Seminario's appeal had been altered after its submission, allowing her to avoid reimbursing Diaz. Although this initial charge did not merit further explanation, Diaz's lawyer was beginning to question the entire premise of Doña Seminario's defense. On November 24th of 1855, Diaz accused Doña Seminario of altering documents that verified Raigada's freedom. According to this account, Seminario was aware of Raigada's freed status. More importantly, she physically changed the document of the sale, which constituted the crime of plagiarism. The judge interrogated Seminario regarding these charges, and she denied any transaction with Don Ramón Diaz. Rather, she claimed that her uncle had held the title of ownership, which her aunt had given directly to Don Diaz upon the sale. Despite this new, tenuous defense strategy, Seminario maintained that she did not know if Mariana Raigada was free and simultaneously displaced responsibility for the title of ownership. Doña Seminario had purchased a slave from Don Navarrete, and, quote, she was not free, as she had been held previously as a slave, end quote. In this way, Doña Seminario continued to argue that she did not know if the slave Mariana, as she continued to call her, was free when she sold her to Don Diaz. Don Ramón Diaz was not convinced. Still awaiting reimbursement, on November 27th, he submitted a plea demanding that the court continue to investigate the written documentation surrounding the case. He clarified that his aim was, quote, not to damage in any way the reputation of Doña Adela Seminario, but only to dissolve her money and denounce a crime that deserves punishment, end quote. Despite the apparent stasis of the case, Diaz's insistence appears to have resulted in uncovering an essential document relating to Mariana's status. Following Diaz's plea, a document titled Junta de Inscripción para los Efectos del Decreto de 3 de diciembre de 1854 appears in the court record. This typed document, as you can see the typed writing on top and actually in the document itself, included empty spaces filled in by hand that state Mariana's age as 49, her status as single, and her occupation as seamstress or costurera. The signatures of the Piuran governor, a priest, a witness, and Adela Seminario appear at the bottom. I can kind of point out Adela Seminario's signature right here, because we'll be seeing that again. Above Doña Seminario's signature appears her note, which basically says, this receipt belongs to Don Félix Silva. You can kind of see that right here. Toque pertenece a Don Félix Silva, which is dated March 20th, 1855. The registration document displays the former slave's name at the top as Mariana Seminario, not Raigada, and the name appears alongside a blotted out marking in the shape of an X. It's really hard to see, I think, on this display, but this is exactly what I'm talking about here. There's an X that's clearly blotted out with ink, and then the name next to it in Seminario's handwriting is Mariana Seminario there. Replacing Mariana's previous surname with her own, Seminario simultaneously asserted her ownership of her, quote, servant, while also practicing a long-standing act of social control intended to prevent any subversive actions by slaves. Doña Seminario presented this document to the judge to argue that she ceded the receipt to Don Félix Silva and he to Don Diaz, who has nothing to do with me. That's a quote. Although it appears a confounding displacement of guilt, Doña Seminario's testimony was consistent. She was not responsible for knowingly selling a slave who had already been freed because her uncle, presumably Silva, had sold the title of ownership to Don Diaz, and this was vis-a-vis Silva's unnamed spouse, or Seminario's aunt. Furthermore, Doña Seminario claims that when the court requested the document from Silva, he asked Mariana Raigada for it, and Doña Seminario's telling, quote, the servant Mariana Seminario hid the official document and with the yearning to be free had given him another receipt, end quote. This argument presents a logical conundrum that remained unspecified by the plaintiff throughout the case. Regada would only have possession of her own title of ownership if she were in fact free. The judge did not interrogate this line of reasoning, but it did serve to further distance Doña Seminario from the charge of plagiarism. Doña Seminario's tactics of stalling and displacing responsibility effectively prevented her from conviction of criminal charges, and Don Diaz returned the case to civil court in November. The same justice of the peace, Francisco Meneses, had ruled that Mariana Regada was free, but Doña Seminario had still not reimbursed Don Diaz the 150 pesos she owed him for the fraudulent sale. Because she demurred Justice Meneses' ruling, Diaz pointed out on December 15th she was able to flee from her responsibilities in Piura to live in Lima. Diaz's frustration is clear in these records as he again raised criminal charges against Doña Seminario on December 17th. Apparently deciding to drop the murky charge of plagiarism, Don Diaz again complained that Seminario's appeal provided her the time to flee the civil sentence. He turned the focus of the case to the criminal act of, quote, having maintained Mariana Regada in slavery, inscribing her a number amongst her goods, and selling her as such, end quote. He went on to express that he was, quote, indifferent whether the sale was made to Juan, Pedro, or Diego, as the crime consists in having conserved a free person as a slave and in having alienated and treated her as such for a fixed price, end quote. Diaz's lawyer also specified the judicial regulations and legal codes that Doña Seminario's defense had allowed her to traverse, complaining that her appeal prevented the agente fiscal, the local representative of the National Fiscal Ministry, from collecting the money she owed Don Diaz. Notably, the prosecutor did not mention the decree of December 3, 1854, as relevant to establishing Regada's freedom, nor did he call upon her to testify at any point in the case. Still awaiting resolution through January of 1856, Diaz raised criminal charges against Doña Seminario again on February 1st. This time he included the charge of plagiarism and added a summary of the documentary evidence of the case up to that point, which he submitted on February 8th. The court records show no response from Doña Seminario, and her flight to Lima severely limits our knowledge of the final resolution of this case. Nonetheless, Don Diaz's litigious persistence, as well as the court's receptivity to his various accusations, reveal which arguments were deemed effective in the local and national arenas. Don Ramón Diaz reiterated his charges against Doña Seminario before the criminal court on February 26th in a final plea for justice. Here he insisted that Doña Seminario's sale of a free person under the condition of a servant constituted plagiarism, again, regardless of the indistinguishable transaction process. He also expressed his disappointment with the judicial system for failing to resolve the case. This process, he complained, had parted from principle. The fiscal agent, Diaz argued, carries, quote, the disgrace of not examining the questions from their true point of view, end quote. In his closing arguments, Diaz understood his point of view to be the same as Mariana Regada's. The court's point of view parted from principle by assuming Regada to be a slave. In Diaz's view, two facts were clear. He had produced all of the certified documentation necessary to prove the unquestionable liberty of the person who was sold, and Doña de la Seminario had received 150 pesos for this person. The supposition that Regada had to prove her freedom was notoriously erroneous, as Diaz put it. The inherent problem of the convoluted legal process for Don Diaz was essentially this. This is a direct quote from his final arguments. If Mariana had been the actor or demander of her freedom before the justice of the peace, and Doña de la Seminario the demanded and contradictor of the declaration of freedom, then and only then would the courts alienate the nullity challenged by the fiscal ministry, end quote. Diaz was pointing out an essential flaw in the legal process that allowed Doña Seminario's defense to succeed. The verbal sentence certified by the justice of the peace was insufficient for the fiscal ministry, which was not convinced of Doña Seminario's responsibility for the sale. However, if Mariana Regada had asserted her freedom to Doña Seminario while working as her servant, the case would have been resolved in the criminal court. Appealing to a higher national authority proved insufficient to resolve this local case, much to Diaz's disappointment. In Diaz's view, therefore, Raigada's ignorance of her own freedom and Seminario's duplicity in maintaining her as a slave were the central issues preventing the administration of justice. Fiscal agent Don Josente Clemente Peralta was assigned to the case on January 27th. The following day, Don Diaz submitted to Clemente Peralta a document as evidence for his accusation. Unfortunately, writing on the document had or has since been intentionally crossed out. You can see this at the top here. I was really disappointed to get to this page, the final page of the document. But this obfuscation only somewhat limits the document's significance. The crossed-out writing appears below the official seal of the Peruvian Republic, as you can see, suggesting the material was recorded under the authority of the agente fiscal, Clemente Peralta. The scratch marks have worn through the paper over time and rendered much of the writing illegible. However, 3 signatures appear clearly at the bottom. The first is Doña Adela Seminarios, and then Don Diaz's attorney, Rafael Semitagoya's ornamental signature. You can kind of make this out. It's a bit hard to see. Right here. And finally, the simple marking of an X resembling that of the registration document, which was dated March 20th. Unfortunately, the illegibility of the document leaves much to speculation. Given the visible signatures, this final page of the notarial record may have been the long-awaited legally binding agreement between Doña Seminario and Don Diaz's attorney. Nevertheless, the motivation prompting the destruction of the documentation, as well as the mysterious X, remain enigmatic. Accessing the document based on the contextual clues within the court record itself, it may be safe to infer that the X is Mariana Raigada's signature. I don't know how well this appears on the screen. This is the X I'm talking about right here. You kind of see there's a little box and then clearly an X mark. The Piuran public notary who documented this case, Manuel Rebolledo, included a summary of its proceedings. The summary states that Doña Colonna had lent Raigada 200 pesos for her manumission, quote, and she specifies that the signature is hers and that she signed the document without knowing its contents, end quote. However, the convoluted process that this document underwent as Raigada's ownership transferred to Diaz complicated and hindered the judicial process, leaving the courts unable to identify and punish the guilty party. Just as this documental obscurity taunted Don Diaz's efforts to prove Doña Seminario's guilt, the challenge continues to frustrate a clean historical narrative of this case. A contemporary view is burdened further by the deteriorated and disorganized state of the documents and by an apparent intentional act to conceal information, as you can see on this page. Could this deletion of information have been the act of plagiarism to which Don Diaz objected? At first gloss, this might appear a reasonable conclusion. However, given the chronology of the case, it is more likely that Diaz was referring to the registration document that I showed you in slide 7. Oops, sorry. This one. Because he had access to it before the title of ownership was submitted. There may also be reason to suspect that Doña Seminario had tampered with this document specifically, especially given its role in the process of abolition. Ramón Castilla's December 3rd decree declared the end of slavery, but this was contingent upon his military's victory against his rival caudillo, Rufino Echenique. Following the December 5th victory, Castilla managed the process of abolition in several stages. As Peruvian historian Humberto Rodríguez Pastor has documented, news of Castilla's decree initially dispersed through unofficial printed flyers. Lima newspaper El Comercio first mentioned the decree on December 18th, but Castilla was aware that some Peruvians still held slaves as late as 1860. El Comercio finally published the official decree in more detailed form on January 23rd of 1855. As a law, it included specific instructions on how the abolition process should be carried out in slaveholding communities such as Piura. The first step was the creation of juntas de inscripción, or registration boards, consisting of the governor, a priest, and a neighbor as witness. The purpose of these boards was to collect information on slaves and servants to submit to the National Registry that would make them officially free in the process. However, Castilla was cautious not to overburden the slaveholding aristocracy, as the law also guaranteed indemnification for their losses and severe punishments for any crimes committed by former slaves or servants. Most significantly for this case, the law made a special provision for newly freed slaves and servants who still worked in domestic service, requiring them to remain in their current homes until they could be reemployed. Given this provision, women such as Mariana Regada could remain in the same conditions with meager pay and no freedom of movement indefinitely. Knowledge of these provisions would have certainly influenced Doña Seminario's decisions regarding her domestic servant. Following a description of Regada's physical condition on this document, the registration document includes an unprompted statement. Her value is 200 pesos. I don't know if you can make this out. It's essentially right here at the end of the document. It's hard to see on the screen, I think. And she dates this February 12th, 1855. Below the names of the governor, priest, and neighbor appears another brief statement in Doña Seminario's handwriting. Quote, "This receipt belongs to Don Felix Silva, dated March 20th. As this date fell just a month before her alleged transaction with Don Diaz, Doña Seminario did have a motive to alter this document in order to displace responsibility for the sale. As the only piece of evidence submitted to the court at that point in the trial, Don Diaz likely suspected that Doña Seminario had added and backdated the line attributing ownership to Don Silva after he raised civil charges against her. However, his attorney decided not to specify this line as the act of plagiarism, and they focused the judge's attention on a deceitful act that constituted a vague form of plagiarism that allowed her to sell a manumitted slave. Nevertheless, Diaz and his attorney prosecuted Doña Seminario for the egregious act of treating another human being as chattel. In disregarding Regada's status as a freed person, Seminario was upholding a dying institution. But both parties in the case represent one important reason for the slow process of abolition, namely economic interests. Don Diaz was certainly motivated by his own economic interests, and his disappointment with the judicial system likely resulted from his lack of compensation rather than any human rights concern. After all, he was attempting to purchase a slave, meaning his social status could not have been far from that of Doña Seminario's. As Regada's registration document shows, Doña Seminario similarly sought the maximum indemnification for her slave. Still, in the process of demanding compensation, Diaz exposed an essential flaw in the legal process of abolition. The same jurisdictional confusions, local social practices, and legal obfuscations would permit some Peruvians to hold others as slaves until at least 1860. As this case shows, appealing to a national authority would not guarantee an enforcement of justice at the local level. Beyond the challenge of altered documentation, the absences from this case reveal the social expectations of the Piuran aristocracy at the time of abolition. At no point did the plaintiff, defense, or any court authority call upon Mariana Regada to testify, even though the case revolved around her legal status. Public notary Manuel Rebolledo recorded that Regada was unaware of her own freedom, but this may have been an assumption, as she's never called to testify. He viewed Castilla's abolition decree as irrelevant to the case, as he does not mention it upon the submission of a former slave's registration document as the first step in the abolition process. The decree clearly concerned Doña Seminario economically, and the beginning of abolition likely stirred Don Diaz's frustration and his sense of urgency to receive reimbursement. Throughout the notarial record, Regada is referred to as sierva, criada, or esclava, interchangeably, suggesting that her status did not change with the manumission or with slavery's abolition. The notarial records also later label her as a samba, and Doña Seminario only describes her as a seamstress, costurera, in the registration document to confirm her monetary value. While this microhistory is inherently limited in its ability to represent the lived experiences of Piurans in the time of abolition, its intricacies and contexts show that 1854 through 1856 was not a moment of market transition. Rather, this case underscores the slow process of gaining freedom and the challenges that Afro-Peruvians would continue to face and overcome throughout the 19th century.